Ludiscere or Ludiscere?
Yeah, the latter, Ludiscere. It's an you probably already know, I guess, being a philosophy expert, but
Yeah.
it's like a portmanteau of ludere and discere, the Latin verbs for to play and to learn.
Yeah.
Um,
The I picked it out. I recognized it because the one thing that I really learned from my one semester of law school before I dropped out was that if you want something to sound important and real, you write it in Latin.
yeah, for sure.
And as long as it's written in Latin,
Yeah.
it's real and you
Yeah.
didn't make it up.
Exactly.
It's the easiest way to sound old.
But at the same time, like I kind of I made the name just kind of on a whim, and like with no intention of ever getting like any sort of following, no matter how small. And now I've realized no one's ever pronounced it right apart from you in this exact
Oh, yeah.
instance. So
Oh,
like
yeah.
I'm definitely like everyone's taken to calling me Ludi instead. And I'm kind of like, sure. Like I think everyone sees it and they get like, Ludi. Yeah, we'll stick with the first half. That's fine. I'm okay with that. So like I'm
Yeah.
almost on the verge of changing the entire channel name to.
No, you can't change it now. You're too far in.
I don't know.
You've got a brand. Your brand is lewd.
My brand is unpronounceable.
Yeah. You just
but-
got. Okay, but here's the thing. In the future, when you finally do merch, a T-shirt with an enunciation guide
Yeah.
underneath your name.
True. That's a good idea.
No one will actually be able to pronounce it, but at least you'll have published something that tells people what to say.
Yeah.
But everyone will still just call you Ludi.
Yeah. They pretty much will.
Yeah, there are. I mean, even with my name, SocraTetris, it's a pretty simple little portmanteau.
Yeah.
But it's. I've seen so many people get very confused with how to pronounce it. They don't see
Really?
the two halves, the Socra and the Tetris.
Yeah.
Like, so I get people going SocraTetris, and it's like, So that's why I capitalize the T now.
Yeah, makes
To
sense.
to get people to be like, hey, look.
Yeah.
Of course, in the early days, I spelled Tetris not with an I, but with an E, because I was afraid they were going to sue me. So we'll walk down that rabbit hole when I get super rich and famous. So,
Yeah.
what's going on with you? What's next for the YouTube channel Ludiscere? I've been following your stuff for a while. We seem to be in a little bit of a vacation mode, taking some relaxation time. But that always makes me think, and if I know video essayists, that you're working on something. That something is in the background just waiting to lurch onto the scene, and you're like, I won't tell anyone. It needs to be a surprise. I want the scoop. I want
Okay.
the scoop.
It's a kind of combination of it being a bit of a surprise, and also I think everyone knows. So like I don't talk about it much, like what I'm doing, because I'm a believer of that thing where you have a bit more pressure added on the more info you give about your project. If you start
That's
telling
true.
people, oh, I'm this far through, here's what it's going to be, this is when I'm going to finish it, suddenly you've got expectations of everyone else, and I kind of like keeping it pretty internalized. But my next project is going to be about Final Fantasy IV. Every other video, it's taken me a while to do them, but I've done a video on Final Fantasy 1, Final Fantasy 2, Final Fantasy 3, and I'm interspersing those with another video. So I'll do Final Fantasy 1, something else, Final Fantasy 2, something else, because the Final Fantasy series is my favorite. And I've been working on the 4 one for a while, and there's been a few like hiccups along the way. So I recently had to move to a new flat, or apartment, I guess, depending on the viewer, because of like landlord issues. They decided to sell the property, so
Oh,
we
no.
were kind of forced into a quick move. And when you're trying to like view 3 new properties a day, and then you go home and you try to record footage, you're kind of like, oh god, this is too much. So that's kind of slowed that down.
All right, well, that is a scoop. I was wondering why your Final Fantasy videos it stopped at 3, because it's like, well, but if in my understanding, 4 and 6.
Yeah.
Unless this is some Final Fantasy publishing nonsense, and 4 or 6 are actually the same one, and I don't know that. But I've always been told that 4 and 6 are the ones that are like the big early golden age Final Fantasy.
That's right.
The special ones, the ones that turned out just really amazing and are long beloved by the fans.
That's
and then it goes 7 and then 10 for less people, but then after that it's really just whatever Final Fantasy you played first, that's the one you love the most.
Yeah, pretty much.
But for those early games, 4 and 6 are the big ones.
Yeah, for sure.
So, since we're talking about Final Fantasy IV, I don't know if this is where we're headed, but welcome to the Gamers Tell All video game podcast, where we explore the question, what's the most significant thing you can learn from a game? And today, we have with us Ludiscere. Ludiscere, are we going to talk about Final Fantasy IV today?
Maybe a bit. I don't think exclusively. But I'm sure it'll come up.
All right, that's fair enough. But so let me ask, what is the game that you want to talk about? The game that taught you something that is still very secretive, because I haven't asked you that question yet.
I'm trying to decide if I'm going to talk about The Binding of Isaac, or if I'm going to talk about some combination of Final Fantasy X and 14. Or maybe a mishmash of both.
You know, there's time. We can get to these things. But you said Binding of Isaac first, so
yes.
I think chances are that's what's primarily in your heart.
Probably.
Or at the very least, in the back of your brain, scratching away, saying, let me out. As a Catholic, the game Binding of Isaac scares me.
Understandably.
Because it's not... I mean, it's silly, but it's also not inaccurate to how some people get about our religion.
I think it's obviously, this isn't going to get... I'm not an expert on this by any means, so I won't get too deep into it. But I think this kind of thing brings some people a lot of joy and some people a lot of misery. And I think the guy who made the game, Edmund McMillan, that's hard to say, I think he had a relatively unfortunate upbringing around that kind of environment that led to the creation of the game. Obviously, this isn't a catch-all for everyone who is surrounded by these kind of stimuli. But I guess it's, important for the sense of artistic expression that he was able to get that idea across, even if it isn't possibly the most legitimate way of conveying,
Well, I actually find that it's, especially with games, one of the most important things that a game can do as an art piece, when we don't look at it as an entertainment product, is that it is a way to communicate an experience of an idea rather than just trying to tell you about an idea or argue for a point of view. I guess whoever it was, I forget, described games as empathy machines, because you can take an experience and feel and have the idea for yourself rather than having it be told to you externally. And even when it comes to very serious ideas, or even if it's a very serious critique, like lightheartedness, humor is often the safest way that people can communicate a very heavy or even a traumatizing idea, because humor allows us to bring our walls down and feel comfortable, feel safe in a space to discuss ideas that are less comfortable, more problematic, and actually explore them, rather than start from a position of being ready to fight or defend one position or another. Having a cute visual, even though the story is very much about abuse experienced by a child at the hands of an overbearing religious parent, the presentation allows us to engage with it rather than be disgusted by it.
For sure.
Video games in particular are it's at least in the United States, this may be different in some other country, but depicting violence towards children is absolutely one of those things that is considered not allowed. It doesn't match with compliance. Audiences don't like it at all.
Yeah.
Like, there is no degree of violence towards children that is really acceptable in games.
Yeah.
Even when, like, say, Detroit Become Human has an entire scene where there is an abusive parent abusing a small child at the very beginning. You never visually see the abuse. It has to be hidden because otherwise, by compliance standards, the American audience wouldn't buy the game.
Yeah.
And like you see that in horror as well,
Yeah.
like, horror movies. And so because it's cartoony, like we know Isaac is a child, but we don't associate him visually as a child. So it lets us explore the idea by letting us lower our walls, our barriers.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, I kind of went into
No, it was
explaining
good.
the game for you.
I liked listening to it. It was fun.
But what's your perspective on it? What did Binding of Isaac teach you?
I think the way to look at it for me is there's a kind of juxtaposition between how grotesque and disgusting and visceral the game is and is presented, and how much of, somewhat ironically, it became, I say this with like inverted commas, I guess, a safe space for me. I have a spinal disease. I have chronic pain. I suffer like from, I've got a lot of body problems, and quite often I want to play a game, but there's a certain kind of mental energy sometimes I feel like you need to be able to invest to play something. And sometimes you want to play something, but you're not entirely feeling up to the full experience. And for the last nearly 10 years, the game that I've put on when I haven't felt quite well enough to do something else is The Binding of Isaac, which is bizarre because it's probably one of the hardest games I've ever played. But it's reached a point now where there's just something so comforting about the environment and the idea, like the concept behind the roguelike kind of trying and trying again, which I just find really soothing. It's so soothing and calming despite the horror surrounding you. And it was that kind of idea, the curiosity surrounding the juxtaposition between these two things, and also the idea of patience that roguelikes automatically give you, the kind of, again, irony, if you will, of really hard games being a place where you're actually punished the least. Somewhere relaxing, where if I lose a run in The Binding of Isaac, it doesn't matter because I can just try again. There's no real consequences for failure. It's okay. It's somewhere where I can just say, if I'm not doing very well, and I just kind of want to have something fun for half an hour, I can go do a run, and if I lose at the end, it doesn't matter, because I've lost nothing. It's the ultimate space for me to just not have any external worries. It's hard to put into words exactly.
Well, I get it's a little bit. I do have my comfort games as well. It's just more famously, my comfort games really don't have... like, my main comfort game is Warframe that I always go back to. And it doesn't really have a fail state, at least at the point that I'm at. I get it from the perspective of you can fail a mission, but in that game, failing a mission does feel like wasted time because you lose access to the resources that you were gathering to build stuff. Whereas I assume that Binding of Isaac as a roguelike wouldn't have anything like that. It's a true roguelike, right? It's not a roguelite. So there's no... And this is actually something that keeps me away from roguelike games. I don't like a lack of feeling like I have permanent progress. And so I famously have tried to like roguelike games and never got into any of them. But I guess the point that I really want to start exploring first then, because you did go into a lot, and there's a few different angles we could tackle your experience with Binding Isaac from. So let me try to come at it sideways just to get
Yeah,
you to talk
absolutely.
a little bit more on it. Do you think that familiarity, just simply having gotten used to it and having gotten good at it,
Yeah.
is what allows Binding of Isaac to become a comfort game for you? Or is it something else? Did it do something else to attract you in the first place that gave you that feeling and then kept you around?
I think it's a tricky one because I think I actually ended up finding it like to be a safe space and getting good at it. No, let me reword that.
It's okay. Take your time.
So I got good at the game and played it a lot as a result of initially playing on a whim and finding it surprising how much I enjoyed the idea of failure not really being a stumbling block. I'm trying to just consider my words so I don't sound like a muppet.
That's okay. I sound like a muppet every day. It's actually pretty fun. So let me jump in then.
Yeah.
If the dynamic was that, I guess it was your first time clicking with a game that didn't punish failure, even though
it does in a way. Yeah.
Right. So I guess one of the things that roguelikes do, and I guess you could also say this from like the perspective of the Soulsborne, the Souls-like
I was gonna bring that
games,
up.
is that they market themselves as being very difficult games
Yeah.
for people in a more hardcore community.
Yeah.
They often have visuals and stories that are a bit more on the edge to sell that difficulty to the audience. But other than time, there really is nothing the games do to set you back.
Yeah.
There's, other than the amount of time it takes to die, load, and go and try again,
Yeah.
nothing gets in your way. Whereas other games, like I mentioned with Warframe, you could lose resources. Like with Souls, yeah, you could lose your
degree,
souls,
yeah.
but at the same time, they're balanced remarkably well, such that as you're progressing forward, normally you're probably going to have enough experience to be where you need to be for the next part of the game. They almost guarantee it by having bosses give you the experience necessary to be in the next part of the game after you do accomplish that challenge.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, once you realize that losing doesn't mean anything, only winning means something, because winning means progress,
Yeah.
you get to disconnect yourself from the fear of loss.
Yeah.
I mean, it can still be very frustrating when you invest
Of course.
a ton of time into it, and people can play it, they can choose to play it in a frustrating way, or you can choose to play it in a way that is more about accepting the repetition and learning the game through the repetition.
Yeah.
And then once you've learned it, it becomes second nature. It becomes
Yeah.
flow. So are we saying that with Binding of Isaac, it's more of just that even though the subject matter was so edgy, it wasn't the subject matter that attracted to you, but
No, not
that
at all.
you got a keen sense of flow from it almost immediately, despite it seeming off-putting, and that juxtaposition was appealing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think there was something about the gameplay loop where even after a few attempts at the game, you see tangible progress. Because just on the first few floors, even if you're just fighting the same enemies, you'll notice that there's a limited amount of things they can do. And even from a very early on point, you notice, oh, I can learn these patterns and I can adapt. And as you say, eventually it becomes second nature and flow. And when it hits that point, you keep on finding a steady state of progression as you go through and through and through. But that just consolidates the earlier things. So it just means that you're always progressing, you're always learning. It doesn't matter if you lose. And eventually you hit a point where it's almost like like speaking a language in the sense that, well, that you're fluent in at least, that you don't even have any active thoughts about what you're doing. And there's something so freeing about the idea of just kind of putting your hands on the controller, or keyboard, I guess, if you play with keyboard and mouse, and just kind of letting, you know, the game kind of play you, almost.
You're describing it like you experience a kind of Zen meditation from playing the game, like you're having an experience of no self because you just get into the action of it.
It's funny. It's I don't even look at it like for what it is anymore. Occasionally, I'll play it, and my girlfriend will come along, and I'm fighting like a monster that's made of intestines or feces or something. And I'm just looking at it, and the only thing I'm thinking is, as soon as it does the telegraph that it's going to do this, I have to move here. And my girlfriend comes and she's like, what are you playing? Like, what am I looking at right now? And then I look at it, and I think for the first time, oh yeah, that is pretty gross, actually, yeah. And
you come to remember that, oh right, there's a thing here.
That's pretty, this is horrible. But it puts me in such a state of kind of calm and relaxation, again, which is unusual because it's such a difficult and disgusting game, that I honestly start to forget what I'm actually playing. And it becomes more of an exercise in Zen, I guess, like you say. I mean, I don't even really play it to win or lose. Obviously, I'm always attempting to beat the run, but I'm a relatively calm person anyway, but there is something so nice about being able to just play something and not have any kind of external pressure pushing you down, not thinking, oh, I really need to do this, or I've wasted time, or I've only got one shot at this. It's the same, like, it's what I was going to maybe say about other games as well, is it kind of teaches you the value of taking your time. Pardon me. There's no real rush. I can just do this as many times as I want. There's my favorite. This is maybe a weird thing to say, but I studied German at university. I did. I've lived in Germany. I speak the language, and I came across a quote when I was studying abroad that a German person once said to me, which is "Alles tut seine Zeit," which basically translates to everything in its own time. And it really resonated with me.
Yeah,
where,
that's nice.
Like, stuff is going to happen when it's going to happen, you know. It's kind of, I guess, the closest English equivalent is something like good things come to those who wait.
Those who wait.
That kind of vibe. And something about that, like, it maybe sounds cliche, but it really stuck with me that when I'm playing a game like The Binding of Isaac, everything's just going to happen at its own time. If I don't get it this time, I'll get it the next time. And it allows me to play a game completely barrier free. And it's just funny because it is the most difficult game that I play, probably. And it's also the game I'm best at. And I think it's the game I'm best at because I have absolutely no weights pushing me down.
Yeah, no hang-ups, no anxiety about
nothing. It's just, if I fail, it's fine. I play a lot of Final Fantasy XIV, which is an MMO, obviously. And
social pressure.
Yeah.
To perform well.
I'm like, this time, I don't know if you know anything about the game, but there's a kind of content which is called Savage. It's really difficult, and this was the first time recently that I tried to do Savage content, and you're doing it with 7 other people, and it's definitely... Am I allowed to swear? Is this kind of...
Yeah, go ahead. We're past the first minute. Pass as much as you want.
God, I was holding it in, Scottish person inside of me, just being like, don't say fuck yet. So basically, like, if you fuck up once in this, like, 10-minute fight, you've wasted everyone else's time, and that really stresses me out. And it means that sometimes, even though I do enjoy playing the game and I enjoy doing the content, sometimes the kind of awkward, like, God, I really don't want to be the one guy who messes this up for everyone. This is people's free time, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And it does put a slight damper on me enjoying the game. But then in something like The Binding of Isaac, I'm beholden to no one but myself. And I am not going to be mad at myself if I mess up. And it allows me to just chill.
Yeah. It's strange because you're also bringing the concept of difficulty into this, and like from my perspective, I understand that perhaps because of the kind of game it is, it's more easy to pick up, put down. Well, the current game that I have on my console, which is absolutely I'm not in the headspace to play this yet game, is actually Disco Elysium, which has no difficulty. It's just choosing options and engaging with the narrative. So in terms of like anxiety about playing a game, about performing well, there is nothing external from my perspective that's keeping me from going in there, and yet I do experience a kind of anxiety that keeps me from playing, from wanting to be in the right headspace and have the right time to really engage with the world and the story. And then I don't, because I think like, oh well, I only have like 30 minutes to an hour, which is never true, because I played Warframe for like 3 hours straight yesterday, so I had the time, but there's a thought that blocks you.
I totally know what you mean.
So I want to actually kind of explore the aspect of difficulty in the game, and maybe not so much the difficulty but the presentation, because you're saying that a large part of it is overall the idea you've been communicating is that the game teaches and reinforces in you the idea that it is okay to fail, that failure is not the end. Failing forward is a completely legitimate way to enjoy your time or spend your time or make progress. And that even when you hit that roadblock, it's no reason to stop or give up. And I think that's a really important message to get. And I think a lot of difficult games do try to sell that message. Like the original Dark Souls was very much like giving up is the only failure. Everything else is something you can overcome. And I guess I want to also bring up from the perspective of, you mentioned your experience with chronic pain. And I want to pick at whether or not those things, with your early experience of the game, if you can remember that far back, and now, if its presentation of difficulty and its subject matter of essentially some kind of suffering, an abuse or trauma of some kind, also helps to resonate with you. Like maybe you weren't thinking about your pain at that time, but you did bring it up, so that makes me think that maybe the fact that it could... Did the game empathize with your pain? Did you feel a sympathetic relationship to it from that expression?
I felt a relationship to it mechanically, but not thematically.
Okay. Can you go into that a little bit more? Because I know we already talked about the mechanics, so maybe focus on the thematics.
Sure. So it's funny because often when I play games, I'm very narrative focused. Almost exclusively so, where I am definitely the kind of person, if I played a game that I thought had a fantastic story and everything else was kind of fine, I'd probably hold it in quite high regard. That's just my personal take on things. So it was unusual for me to go into a game like The Binding of Isaac that definitely could have, story beats and kind of narrative ideas that I could potentially relate to, and I just never really thought about it. I thought, oh well, like this is pretty tragic subject matter. You have that first cutscene, and then you kind of have different endings that give you more information. And I just never really... It's not even that it didn't occur to me, it's just that when I first played it when I was 17, I'm 27 now, and there was something... At that time, I'd recently been diagnosed with the condition that I have. And I think it was like, when you're looking for an escape in something... and I'm kind of someone who finds a joy in repetition. I find a kind of, it's a soothing kind of behavior.
Absolutely.
There's something nice about just doing something over and over and over again. And I think probably as a kind of crutch almost, some kind of like form of self-medication in a way, if that doesn't sound too dramatic. Was I was looking
However
for
you
some
need
kind
to describe it.
I was looking for something to
the people at home won't get offended.
No, I mean it's just, you know, when you're kind of mentally grasping onto something, thinking I need something to keep me afloat here, and sometimes you just need stimulus that kind of scratches an itch. Mm-hmm. And for me, the itch I needed scratched there just happened to be something that I could, you know, weird imagery, I guess, but like a wall that I could just bang my head against repeatedly, just keep trying and trying and trying. And I think any connection between the reason I started playing the game and the thematic content of the game is entirely coincidental, which is probably quite unusual.
I'm honestly surprised. I thought I was going to get something neat out of that question, but I'm
really sorry to disappoint.
Don't worry about it. It's a perfectly valid answer. I mean, there are other experiences that I can say that I brought up on games simply because I wanted to try them and fail at them. I mean, I probably never got to the point of seeing and overcoming, and this maybe is the opposite, but I did, for some time, played Bennett Foddy's Getting Over It when I was a kind of, you know, negative mental space, and like all of my like things in work and things with, I just hit my mic. things in work and things with technology were all breaking down. Like it was a pretty rough time. I didn't even have internet in my place in my apartment at the time, so I couldn't even upload the videos I was making for YouTube at home. I had to go to a cafe or to a library and steal their Wi-Fi. And I would absolutely understand this sort of, I mean, even with Bennett Foddy, I never made progress in that game. I never got over it with the getting over it. Yeah. But I still did use it as, like, for a short time when I was having a rough spot, as I need to be fully invested in this thing that makes me angry because I am angry. And I guess in your perspective, rather than the narrative, it was, I need to fully invest myself in a difficult task because I'm facing a difficult task. And it wasn't the Christian imagery of it that that got you to that point. It was, I guess we could call it, the pure story of the Ludens, of just the gameplay itself that got you there.
Yeah. Weirdly enough, that's entirely correct. I imagine a lot of people do kind of resonate with the story of the game. But it's hit a point now for me where it's not entirely irrelevant, but you know, when you start to see a game exclusively as mechanics, when you hit that kind of flow state, and it's just you know, kind of tickles that bit of your brain that's like, oh yeah, this is good, keep it up.
So to pivot us, because I think we've really done well at really sparsing out everything that we have to say about Binding of Isaac, unless there's anything you feel like you've forgotten. I do have a question then that may feel like an entirely separate pivot.
Sounds good.
Based on what you've expressed to me about what you like about the Binding of Isaac, have you played Vampire Survivors?
No, I haven't.
I think you should. I think you will find it to be exactly the opposite experience. But I think you will like it for exactly the same reason.
Sure, okay. That sounds interesting.
Yeah. The way people have been starting to describe what Vampire Survivors is they call it a bullet heaven game, where it's the opposite of bullet hell. You have, rather than being a small ship that is trying to dodge all of the incoming bullets and break the big thing, you're a little guy, usually based on some copyright infringed character, and your goal is to upgrade yourself to become the bullet hell that all of the enemies and monsters have to overcome.
I like the sound of that.
So when I say that, I think you will get the same feeling, but the game will be exactly the opposite of what you experience with Binding of Isaac. That's kind of what I'm describing there. And I only suggest it because I would love to hear your thoughts on it and hear you get back to me if that game does sort of scratch the same itch or if I was entirely off base.
No, I'll definitely give it a go. It sounds great. The idea of becoming the bullet hell is very enticing.
Yeah. I think it's still pretty cheap on Steam. Yeah.
Yeah.
You should be able to find it pretty easy. It's gotten into the dialogue, into the discourse. So, is there anything else that you would like to latch onto, or maybe any other particular point of contrast with either Binding of Isaac or Final Fantasy or one of the Final Fantasies that is just screaming to get out right now?
There was one other thing that I kind of had the idea of saying, an idea that I always struggle to fully put into words. Like, you know, when you have that concept that's totally fully fleshed out in your head, and it just becomes a kind of like puddle on the floor when you try and get it out.
I get that.
It's that my two favorite genres of game are roguelikes and JRPGs.
Yeah.
And I enjoy something from everything, but I've always tried to think, what is it about these two genres that always pull me back? Why are these my comfort spaces?
Especially when the genres are so different.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's kind of related to what we were saying before about being able to take your time. You know, one of these genres, roguelikes, is about as frantic as it comes for gameplay. You're not going to find a more intense way of playing a game usually than playing a roguelike. And often you'll find, if you kind of ignore walking simulators, JRPGs are probably the most casual kind of, you can approach them in a very laconic kind of style. It's a very much the take at your own pace game, and I think that's exactly what I like. I find that when I play games like what's a good example? Something like the 2018 God of War, a game that I really, really enjoy in almost every sense, and I can play it for about an hour and a half at a time. And it's trying to explain why, where I get a sort of fatigue, because the game essentially forces you to exclusively progress. You just have to keep going forward and forward and forward. And after a while, I find this concept to be very tiring. And in almost every JRPG, I think is what annoys a lot of people, is there's so much downtime. And I actually find that when I play games, maybe counterintuitively, I look for the downtime. I don't want to be going all the time, and I think maybe that's something I like about roguelikes. It's short bursts, and in between, I can rest. But like, I would absolutely have no issue playing a JRPG for 10 hours, because with probably only a few hours of actual gameplay within that time, because I'm, you know, wandering around towns, watching cutscenes, doing my own thing, looking through menus. I feel like it's the lack of pressure that I really enjoy, and that's something that's kind of funny. The dichotomy of Final Fantasy XIV is what we said before about the Savage content being so difficult and stressful because of, you know, social influence. And then at the same time, I've spent probably hundreds of hours fishing in that game for literally no material reward. But something about it, just that I can go on and fish for a few hours, and that's it. There's something so interesting about that I'm more drawn to the absolutely pointless fishing than I am the like socially engaging group content. And I think it's to do with being able to take it at my own pace.
I get that a lot. There's game studies like to talk about games in terms of verbs, but I think something that people don't give enough weight to, especially when it comes to the pacing of a game, is that waiting or relaxing, choosing to do nothing, is its own verb. 100%. And when games know how to treat it well, they will incorporate doing nothing into the flow of the game, into the pacing and the arc. Whereas with 2018 God of War as an example, its big selling point was this game's cinematography is all one shot. You never leave behind Kratos, and as you're moving forward, there's never a moment where they stop delivering the story. When you're on the travel sections, which could be quiet moments of just sit here and row forward, they were afraid of the player that would get bored and not like that, and so they put Mimir's storytelling in there and used that as an essential aspect of the plot. So you also, like, you could tune it out, but if you did, you would probably miss a huge portion of the context of what that game's story was telling you. And so you
switched on all the time.
You have to be I almost use a different phrasing that would have been worse, but you do have to be switched. I know what you mean. You do have to be switched on to play God of War. And
I mean, he's a pretty buff guy. I don't know.
I mean, he also is in the water a lot, so he's like, he works out, so he's Anyway, so the story is etc. etc. Relaxation is great in games.
It's just, I think part of the reason I kind of wanted to bring this up with you is that when you hear people discuss games, I think it's so rare that you hear downtime being spoken of as a virtue, or the idea that this game isn't necessarily going to be the most intense, or I guess it kind of runs side by side with there's no negative element for failure. There's no drawbacks for failing.
Right.
So for being able to take your time and being able to lose without consequence.
And they definitely feel interrelated. Sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. Have you ever played the first Xenoblade Chronicles?
I haven't. I hear that game is massive.
Huge.
I was told by a friend of mine in college who was playing, and I think he started playing it like at the end of our sophomore year, and he only finished it like somewhere just before we graduated. So he was playing he was playing that game for like 2.5 years.
I mean, it's not as long as that, but it is pretty long.
He may not have been playing it with a dedicated focus. He might have been taking it more at his own pace, but he was playing that game for a very long time.
It is, as you say, though, it is enormous. The maps are giant, and a lot of the map is empty. And I guess a lot of people say this about Breath of the Wild. I actually think that's a huge benefit, is that sometimes worlds need empty space. And I think for Xenoblade Chronicles is probably like in my top 3 games ever. And I think part of the reason why is a combination of the empty space, and also it's probably the best example of a JRPG that really does not punish you for trying things. There's loads of monsters that are way too hard for you to fight in the early areas, and you're kind of almost encouraged to go see what it's all about, and you'll do it, and they will fuck you up within a second, and what happens is you get spawned with no losses about 10 meters away from the enemy, and it's just like, well, that was fun, wasn't it? Go try again. Or it's something like you'll come to this giant cliff face and you see, like, you're just so tempted, you know that feeling you get when you're up high and you're like, oh,
well, what if
this game lets
Freud's
you jump.
death drive.
There's even I think there's an achievement in the game for literally falling to your death from a high enough point.
That's silly.
Because it's just like, well, we knew you'd try it, and they've let you try it, and there's no consequences. It's fine. Obviously, negative consequences can be important for game design, but I don't think it's always necessary to punish. I think sometimes it's good to encourage, and
encourage play.
Yeah, just it's to encourage play, but it's also to encourage exploration. It's to encourage being able to dive into something without having the fear of what's going to happen if you're wrong. I am always, in real life, terrified of doing things incorrectly. I think that's a very normal feeling.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really nice to be able to kind of enter, my favorite medium and be presented with something which says, this is the only place that you are going to be allowed to actually fuck up with no consequences. And I think everyone needs that.
I absolutely need that plenty of times. Like, there are so many days where I get just down on myself because of, I mean, to bring this back to the Binding of Isaac, I was raised Catholic, so the guilt that is inherent in my soul forms every time I slightly misphrase a word in any social context. Even now, I'm remembering that I ended a sentence too early when I wanted to say to my fiance's best friend, I love coming to your concerts. And I ended that sentence too early, and I'm still thinking about that despite it being 2 months ago.
Yeah, I see why.
And I feel infinite guilt for any little mistake like that. And so it is important to be able to find a space that gives you permission to say, hey, it's okay, little fuck ups don't matter.
I guess that's the ultimate point I've been trying to make over the whole thing.
To get out of here. Well, in order to, I guess, give us a breaking point, I'm going to, I guess so that we can wrap up, I'm going to ask you to imagine something to emphasize the importance of having empty space and waiting in games. I want you to picture the game Shadow of the Colossus. All right, now picture it as just a series of rooms with the colossi in each one.
Yeah.
Are you going to have fun with that game?
Boring as shit.
There would be no grandeur. There'd be no spectacle to actually getting to them
Absolutely
and
not.
seeing them if they were just dots on a line.
I actually think that game is way more interesting because of the distance, because of the gaps.
Because of the chill downtime.
Yeah. It might sound strange, but it's been a long time since I played it. Maybe 13 years since I played Shadow of the Colossus. But it's not the fights that I remember, as cool as they are. It's genuinely not the fights.
It's
the
running
horse.
around with aggro, and then the very bad thing that happens to aggro.
Yeah, let's not talk about that.
And then the very good thing that happens to aggro.
I guess, but that's, still paired with the very bad thing that happens at the end.
Yeah, well, some people have made very lengthy videos saying, no, actually, it was the good thing.
Maybe.
Who knows? That's not really the point. I hit my mic again.
Not.
God dang. All right. Well, Ludiscere.
There you go, almost.
Isn't
it just the
It's so easy to mess up. It is. It's so
honestly.
naturally asking you to make a mistake.
Literally, I've got friends who I've known for years who still say it Ludiscere. Even though I've told them in person, please, it's not right.
Hey,
but I guess, normal English phonetics.
That's fine. English is a broken language anyway. Let's live in the broken. But
good advice.
Let me go ahead and just thank you for spending the time to talk with me this morning / this afternoon, because we're all around the globe at this point.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I would have loved to get my points across a bit more
You did
cogently.
fine. You did fine. Literally every single guest has thought that they didn't get their points across coherently, and everyone has done perfectly. You're very smart. You're intelligent. I loved speaking with you. I'm going to make you take the compliment.
Well, that's very sweet of you. Thank you. It's been really nice to be here.
And we kind of already did a little bit about coming up, but go ahead and tell people about your channel. Where can they find you? And what video of yours do you think they should watch first?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
So I guess you can see from the video itself, but I run a channel called Ludiscere, where it's video essays about games, unsurprisingly. And coming up for me is a video on Final Fantasy IV, and possibly after that a video about Xenoblade 3. And I guess that segues nicely into the videos you should watch if you want to check me out. I'm definitely best known for 2 specific videos, and I think it's probably best to go with the general consensus that you should check those out. One of them is about sexualization in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and the other one is about the mythology behind the video game Hades. If I had to pick one, I'd go for the Hades one.
Yeah.
But make sure you save yourself 3.5 hours.
I will say the one with Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is actually my preferred one. I watched that one
Really?
again recently. It's because I love gender studies, and
fair enough.
you were very measured and thoughtful, and you made sure to really look at all perspectives and come at everything from analyzing the rhetoric and really getting into what is the argument being presented, and entirely looked at the argument only. There was not a moment in that entire video in which you went into critiquing the person or the people who made the game or the people arguing for or against. It was all about what was made, what was argued, and why. And it is so rare to find someone who can put that much analysis and that much depth into analyzing the argument rather than just analyzing the person. It was the least reactive video to a very emotionally engaging topic that I've ever seen, and it was remarkably invaluable. It was so much fun for me.
You're making me blush.
You're going to have to deal with that.
That's very sweet. Thank you. It's kind.
All right. So, anyways, thank you again, Ludiscere. I will probably talk to you soon. And
For sure.
Thank you, everyone at home, for watching. Glad you stuck with us to the end. If you have anything you'd like to add, throw it in the comments below, subscribe, and go check out Ludiscere's channel. There will be a link in the description. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me on.